Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and I want to talk about Chapter 7 in our Western Civ book. So this is really the Middle Ages and sort of the end of the Middle Ages, so this time frame between, say, 1100 and 1460. So the chapter really focuses on what we call the High Middle Ages, which is the latter part of those years, so really somewhere between 1200 and 1400. And the whole idea is this transition from medieval thought, which is basically based in religion, and a transition to modern thought, which is more based in Greek philosophy and science and law, so Latin law. So some of the things that we've studied for the past 6 or 7 weeks are coming to fruition now as far as they relate to Western society today. So that's what we're going to talk about. So there's a lot of stuff in this chapter, and I think of all the chapters in the book, this is one of the best ones if we're trying to relate what happened back then to today. So, one of the big questions here, and I think it starts on page 157 or 158, is, what separates medieval thought or medieval thinkers from modern Western liberal thought. And again, it's all about religion and mysticism. As we move through this chapter, we see first sort of the scholasticism. So you'll read about like St. Thomas Aquinas and this idea of people that are trying to blend this idea of faith and reason together, and I think unsuccessfully in some cases, at least for me. But as you read through and you read about Aquinas, so that's page 162 or so, what he tries to do is put reason and religion together, and basically and it's more complicated than I'm going to explain it, but basically the thing is what Aquinas is saying, that there is a place for reason and there's a place for proof and science, but anything that can't be explained, any natural phenomena that can't be explained, proves the existence of God. So that is sort of a really short overview of what Aquinas is thinking. But again, it just is something in history that indicates that there's this impulse towards rational thought. And with Aquinas, we don't quite make it there yet. But again, he's trying to say that, religion and reason can work together. And I think it's interesting from a historical standpoint because we're in this border between all mysticism and religion and science and reason. So it seems almost to be expected that someone like Aquinas would come along and try to blend both of those things together. So that's part of the scholastic idea that you'll read about. And scholasticism in this case refers to people who are devout as far as Christianity is concerned, but they try to work Greek philosophy and Greek reason, sort of the Aristotle reasoning, into religion. And so it's not always very convincing, but I think that it's interesting to see how this transition is gradual as we go through this period of time between the Middle Ages and modern liberal thought. So there's that part, and then the chapter goes through, and I'm kind of glancing at my notes, the chapter goes through on page 164, and it talks about literature. So there's Geoffrey Chaucer and Canterbury Tales is a good example of this flowering of literature and the sophistication of literature, if you will. And then the book also talks about architecture, this Gothic style that we still live with today, in mostly in church buildings, of course. But the author of the text is writing about the Gothic style, the classic style, again, just to show that there's some instance of modernity and sophistication coming along in the Middle Ages. And also, I would argue, sophistication in construction techniques, because some of these Gothic buildings, especially churches, are pretty complicated. They use that flying buttress style so they can have an open floor plan, and you've all been in churches like that. So you read about architecture, and then also of interest on page 168, I believe, they're talking about these various revolts in France and in other areas. And I think that's interesting because it starts to demonstrate that there's a class system going, that there's a peasant class and a middle class, and they're starting to revolt against kings and lords. And I think it's this notion of a public sphere and this independence as far as the working class goes, starts to show itself at this time. So that's of great interest. We read about the bubonic plague in the mid-1300s that wipes out like a third of Europe. So that's a huge natural disaster. Of course, in the absence of reason, in the absence of knowing about germ theory and how disease, leaps from one person to another, there's these explanations that it's the fault of the Jews. So again, these mystical explanations in the Middle Ages for the bubonic plague kind of gives you an indication of what people were thinking about the time when we knew nothing about germs or how diseases carried from one person to the other. You'll read about the Babylonian captivity, and that's basically where the Pope stayed in France for a long time, and it really begins this narrative on page 170, 171 of the weakening of the papacy, or really the weakening of the Catholic Church to have a lock on Christianity. So that's a really good thing to read, and this idea that the church, the Catholic Church, starts to lose some of its power when secularism and science and radicalism come into play. So that's really one of the huge takeaways from this chapter, that no longer is Christianity going to be defined only by the Pope and by Catholicism. And so as you read through this, you'll read about various Christians who thought the hierarchy of the church was flawed, the ornate church, the ornate popes and cardinals and bishops seemed unlike the common people, and therefore it was really not the true essence of Christianity, which was a religion for everybody. You think of Jesus and the tribes of Jews that he came from, who were, not a showy bunch by any step of the imagination. And now all of a sudden you have this really ornate Catholic Church with a pope and with cardinals and bishops who dress differently. They're the sole interpreters of God's word on earth, and it kind of goes against some of the early Christian doctrines. So we start to see this move towards secularism, and eventually to the Reformation, which we're not there yet, but we will get there. So that's really important stuff. And a lot of this is on page 171 of the reading, so pay attention to that because it's a big deal moving forward. On page 172, I thought it was interesting that the author talked about medieval technology and really took a view that the West was sort of the leader in technology. I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm glad we read the reading last week about the Asian influence in technology, because it makes us think that not everything great came out of the West, and so that Western-centric view is something we still live with today, and it's useful as a creative thinker to consider all different aspects of the dissemination and adoption of technology in the Middle Ages, which is something that I'm into. So check that out. Again, the book finishes this chapter talking about modern liberal thought and the ideas of liberty, the formation of a representative government such as Parliament, the Magna Carta in 1215, which we've already read about. But again, this is indicative of a middle class, or a peasant class even, questioning the authority of the king and questioning the authority of government and questioning the authority of the church. So, with intellectualism and sort of the freedom to have ideas and ideas spreading through the countryside, the natural response to ideas is questioning authority. So that's what we're seeing near the end of this chapter in the 170s, the 172, 173. And then there's a big revelation on page 173, and I think we'll have a question about that. So what's the big difference between thought in the Middle Ages and modern thought? What's the big differentiation between those two styles of thinking, thought, and philosophy? And the answer, of course, is that medieval thought is dominated by religion and really some remnants of mysticism that we read way back in the second and third chapter. And modern liberal thought puts more credence in reason and science. And so pay attention to that, because that's a big, important differentiator between medieval thought and modern thought, and that's what we want to get out of this chapter. So That's it. On page 175, the last couple of pages of the chapter, the author talks about Enlightenment thought. So again, it's that modern liberal thought. And I want you to know that in this time period, somewhere between 1200 and the 1400s is where things start to change. We can see it in the literature, we can see it in the architecture, we can see it in the philosophy, and we start to see it as people are questioning authority, both in the monarchy and kings and also in the church. So it's a great chapter. It's a little long, but it's kind of a fun read. So maybe take it in chunks, get through as much of it as you can because it's pretty important. So that's it for today. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.